Welcome to Intesa Sanpaolo On Air, an English language insight series jointly hosted by Intesa Sanpaolo and the University of Oxford, where we embark on global conversations with global leaders. My name is Rupert Younger, and in this episode, we will be discussing the knotty subject of data privacy in the context of an AI-dominated world. What should we be entitled to keep private? How can we do that? And what protection should be afforded to us by regulation are among the topics in this podcast.
On that row about the WhatsApp messages, the Daily Telegraph says Rishi Sunak has had to deny accusations that he's trying to cover up ministers' actions during the pandemic as the government continues to resist handing over the messages to the COVID-19 inquiry. The paper quotes an ally, Mr Johnson, saying that the former Prime Minister is just a distraction in this and that the messages the government doesn't want to be disclosed are in fact Mr Sunak's.
Data privacy is not a new issue facing us as human beings. The question of our right to privacy is in fact a very old one, but it has been supercharged by the arrival of today's hyper-connected digital age. Our digital age is in its infancy, in reality only really around 25 years old, which is when broadband started to become commercially affordable at scale. Since that time, the amount of information that is being created and shared every day has ballooned. Forbes estimates that 90% of the world's data has been created in the last 2 years. And according to the latest estimates, over 300 million terabytes of data are created each day. To give you a sense of what this means in practice, just 1 terabyte of data would be around 500 million pages of text, 500,000 high-resolution photos, or 200,000 songs. The fact is that most of us now are digital beings. Everything we do is monitored, recorded, captured, and memorialized somewhere by someone. It may be ourselves posting on our social feeds, or it may be the cookies that follow us around as we go about our daily online lives. We all create our own digital exhaust, and this has far-reaching issues when it comes to privacy. Professor Carissa Veliz is a philosopher working at the University of Oxford. She is brilliant and one of the foremost thinkers on privacy today. Carissa has spent years exploring questions relating to what we should be entitled to have by way of a private life. It's vital work of contemporary importance to organisations and policymakers around the world. Carissa's most recent book, Privacy is Power, was shortlisted by The Economist as one of their books of the year in 2022. In it, she explores questions relating to privacy, focusing on ways in which we can all take back control of our data. I asked Carissa why privacy is so important today.
So in the 1990s, your car was a car. You had paid for it. It was yours. You drove it and it took you places. And that was it. And the kind of contract you had with that car, with that product, with that company that had produced that car was quite simple and easy to understand. Today, your car is sort of your car. You paid for it. But it also works for other people. It's collecting reams of data about you, about where you go, inferring things from your location, how you drive, whether you drive fast or not, at what time do you drive, where do you work, where do you live, and even things like, it turns out if you have a smart car, the seat in your car is tracking your weight. The car is also tracking the kind of music you're listening to, from which you can infer all kinds of things, like whether somebody's feeling blue or the opposite. And we don't know about the kinds of data that gets collected. We don't know about the kinds of inferences that are made, and we don't know where that data ends up. We do know that it gets transferred to hundreds of companies that we barely even heard of.
It's not just the car where we are being monitored and exploited. This happens in our home too. For years, our home was our private castle. Today, it has become a porous place where others can enter freely. The pandemic showed just how complicit we all became in this endeavour, holding Zoom meetings in our living rooms or bedrooms. And we now have surveillance in our homes in covert ways too, as anyone who has Amazon's Alexa will know.
We're losing privacy 24 hours of the day. So the first thing you do when you wake up is probably look at your phone. And by doing that, you are letting hundreds of companies know that you have just woken up. The person you sleep next to probably has her phone on her as well. So it's easy to infer things like when people are having an affair. During the day, your phone collects data and it doesn't send it right away, because if it did, you would notice that your battery was draining fast. So what it does is that it sneakily collects data during the day, and then when you plug it in at night, it sends all that data to hundreds of companies. And this data is very sensitive. You might think, well, what do I care that a company knows what kind of music I like? But if that kind of data gets used to infer your sexual orientation or your purchasing power, or whether you're depressed or not, then it becomes sensitive quite quickly.
So why is this such a big deal today? Why has it become a major part of our public discourse?
Now, why is privacy more important than ever? For two reasons. The first is that we have more personal data than ever, and we have more capabilities of analyzing data than ever. And the second reason is that democracy is not in its best moment. The Economist every year has a study that it calls the Democracy Index, and it tracks democracy. And for the past 3 or 4 years, the news are pretty bad. Democracy is not doing well. And it's not only that fewer and fewer countries are democratic, that's also the case, but it's also the case that within democracies, there are authoritarian tendencies that are making democratic countries less democratic than they used to. So at a time when democracy is not in its best moment, it's particularly important to be mindful of asymmetries of power.
We have always been vulnerable to breaches of our privacy. Why should we worry about AI when it comes to privacy? To answer this, I turn to a long-standing friend and colleague, Professor Luciano Floridi.
So my name is Luciano Floridi, and I, at the moment, the OII Professor of Philosophy and Ethics of Information at the University of Oxford. Soon to move to the University of Yale, where I will be the founding director of the Center for Digital Ethics and a professor of cognitive science.
So, Luciano, what exactly is it about AI that makes you worried about human privacy?
Imagine a full example. You know that Mary is either in the office or at home. You don't know where she is. I know that she's not at home. I don't know where she is. But if you put together the two of us, we know exactly where she is. She's in the office. And that is the combination of two bits of information that in and of themselves are not privacy breaching. You don't know and I don't know. But together, we know exactly her location. Now, multiply this by a gazillion of features of Mary and her taste, her inclination, her life, what she eats, who she dates, who she meets, and all of a sudden you have this prism, this diamond, with a gazillion facets that is Mary, a human being, but AI has reconstructed her profile entirely. So that is huge problems.
All of this raises the possibility that we are already too late to protect our privacy, and that we should all just accept that we are public individuals and get comfortable living with that. This raises questions about our future as digital beings. So who better to seek insight from than one of the most prominent futurists alive today?
I'm Amy Webb. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of Future Today Institute. We do long-range scenario planning using technology, data, evidence, a little bit of AI. I'm also a professor at NYU Stern School of Business and a visiting fellow at Oxford.
Amy describes herself as a quantitative futurist whose research focus is on artificial intelligence and how emerging technologies will transform the way we live, work, and govern. I asked Amy straight up whether she thought it was possible to have privacy in today's world.
No, I don't. I think that we did a study and built a model several years ago, and the conclusion was privacy is dead, right? But again, it depends on how you define privacy. So I'm a public person. I am under no illusion that my behaviors, the things that I do aren't discoverable, but I'm very careful about the private aspects of the non-public aspects of my life. And to the extent that I can, I keep those shielded.
One of the arguments often used is that sharing our data is a good thing, that it opens us up to better deals and offers from companies. I put this to Amy, secure in the knowledge that she had thought carefully about this type of issue. For those of you listening who have not yet read her book, The Big Nine, I would recommend that you head straight out to your local bookseller after listening to this podcast or place an immediate order online. As you might expect from a futurist, the book, published 4 years ago, set out the landscape for how AI will, by design, during our lifetimes, begin to behave unpredictably, thinking and acting in ways which defy human logic. It was extraordinarily prescient and led her to the conclusion that just 9 major global corporations may be inadvertently building and enabling vast arrays of intelligent systems that don't share our motivations, desires, or hopes for the future of humanity. I asked Amy if she still held that view.
Okay, here's an example. Amazon in the US has launched in some markets a new model where for a very, very low price, you can get access to telemedicine. And actually, this is one of the things that I predicted was going to happen in one of the scenarios in the book, in the Big Nine book. So it's happened. And that is very, very low cost to healthcare. That's good. In exchange, you are signing terms of service. And one of the things that you are signing away is something called, we have this HIPAA regulation in the United States, which would normally protect the consumer against third-party. And it creates actually lots of problems when you are the party trying to get your own data. But in order to make use of this service, you have to grant Amazon the right to treat Amazon as the third party and give it the ability to use your data in different ways.
So why are we prepared to accept this? To answer this, I needed to find someone who could explain the fundamental essence of what it is to be human, not artificial. For that, I spoke with Deepak Chopra, an author of over 90 books, who trained as a medical doctor before becoming one of the leading voices in the alternative medicine movement. He is perhaps best known for the study of consciousness and Hindu Vedanta philosophy. Confused? Well, I am, so I started by asking him to describe who he is.
Rupert, I'm still trying to figure that out. Honest question is I don't know who I am, but my name is Deepak Chopra, and I am an MD. I trained in internal medicine and then went on to train in endocrinology, which is the study of hormones, and then expanded that to neuroendocrinology, which is brain chemistry. So that's my medical background. I got interested in the 1980s in what is now commonly referred to as the mind-body connection. Then that led to a career in integrative medicine. I have part-time professorships at the University of California in San Diego, in Florida, and now in Mount Sinai in New York.
So, Deepak, why do we participate willingly in this data theft?
So I would say that 99% of humans, if not more, do in fact behave like biological robots. We are, in the spiritual literature, is called the unawakened state. To be a biological robot that's constantly being triggered by people and circumstance into predictable outcomes. Very simple example, somebody insults you on the street. You're offended for the rest of your life. Somebody flatters you and you're happy with that person. In other words, you're at the mercy of every stranger you see on the street. That's the human condition. Biological robots, which in these wisdom traditions is called a state of ignorance. Opposing that is a state of enlightenment, where actually you recognize that between stimulus and response, you have the ability to pause and choose a response, and that you don't have to be a biological robot. But that's a spiritual pursuit called waking up.
Is AI diabolical or a blessing? This is the title of an essay that Chopra published in April 2023. In it, he makes 5 claims. No machine is smart in the human sense. The human brain isn't smart either. No machine or the human brain can experience anything. Experience is the essence of human awareness. And computers can never become aware. which is the only thing that can lead to an experience. He makes a powerful case for us all to become more conscious, and that by being so, we can take back control over our privacy.
When you're not a biological robot, I can choose when I choose to go on a computer and for what reason I do, but our children are not being brought up that way. We now have what we call digital natives, and especially during the pandemic. And I know now kids who were born, just at the cusp of the onset of the pandemic. They think that food comes out of a computer. They think everything is on a computer. Privacy is an issue when you're a biological robot. It's not an issue if you're woken up.
Being human matters. A part of being human is the ability to choose what to remember and what to forget. This is something that AI and the digital universe cannot do. It is programmed to remember, and within that it has an inbuilt retrieval mechanism that immortalizes all of our actions, both those that we are happy to remember, but also, of course, those that we would prefer to forget.
Throughout history, the possibility of forgetting has played a very important role. And it plays an important role for individuals in that it makes life more livable when, you fight with your friend and then you kind of forget about it and you can't even remember why you were fighting and you kind of let it go. And it's been very useful for society because it makes society less ruthless. And throughout history, there have been very natural mechanisms for forgetfulness to play its role. So, of course, our memory is finite and imperfect. But even when we keep record of things, on the one hand, if you keep record, say, on writing, it's very effortful to keep record of things. So you have to choose very carefully what you keep record on and what you don't. And that in itself is a mechanism of filtering what's important and forgetting what's not. But then for a long time, it was actually hard to keep those records alive. So there were moths and there were floods and fires. And before paper had acid in it, it just crumbled. It fell apart. And today we have completely changed the economy of remembering and forgetting. Now the default is remembering everything. And that is an incredibly dangerous experiment. And it makes society incredibly ruthless because anything that is on record at the moment stays on record forever. That's a matter of how we design tech. It's not like that by nature. So we could potentially design files to self-destroy in a year or in 2 years or wherever time. The fact that today the default is to remember is something that we could change.
Carissa Veliz. So, what can be done?
I think the most important thing that we should do is ban the trade in personal data. For the same reasons that we don't buy or sell votes, we shouldn't buy or sell personal data because it gets used much to the same effect. And we can have much of the benefits of personal data by collecting and using it, deleting it when we don't need it, but not selling it. Selling it creates two very bad incentives. The first incentive is to collect as much personal data as possible, because why wouldn't you if you can sell it? And the second incentive is to sell it to the highest bidder. And the highest bidder might not be the most responsible company or person. In fact, they're likely not.
Okay, so there are clearly some tech solutions. And of course, you can already see some of these in action, such as dissolving or self-deleting messages on some social media apps. I feel, though, that there is an elephant in the room that we have not yet discussed, and that is regulation. What should we be allowed to do, and what should be regulated or banned? Carissa Veliz.
So one way to think about personal data is to think about it as an incredibly toxic asset. Yes, it's an asset. Yes, you can sell it, but it's also incredibly risky. If you have a company, by collecting more personal data than what's absolutely necessary, you are creating your own risk. I think there is a tendency to think about risk as something very much external. What's happening with your competitors? What happens with the external world? But sometimes we are our own biggest risk. And one way is by collecting more personal data than we need, because personal data is incredibly hard to keep safe, and a lot of people want it. Criminals want it, intelligence agencies want it, governments want it, data brokers want it, and all kinds of companies want it. And in cyberspace, the attacker has the advantage over the defender, because the defender has to defend itself from all possible attacks at all possible times. And the attacker, if they have enough resources and enough motivation, eventually they'll get to that personal data.
All of this begs the question about the value of our data. If it is valuable, can it really be banned? Surely market forces will prevail, and where there's a profit to be made, there will be a market. Carissa agrees, of course, but raises a fascinating argument about the risks inherent for companies using data, one that I found very powerful.
As individuals, it's exposing us to harms like extortion, public shaming, discrimination. As institutions, it's exposing us to lawsuits and fines and all kinds of scandals. As a society, it's exposing us to dangers like Cambridge Analytica swaying elections and like incredible misinformation and personalized propaganda, and even national security risks.
Some companies are embracing the new privacy world, creating products and operating principles that help consumers protect their privacy. I asked Carissa if this is something that she's seeing.
That's definitely the case. A great example is Apple. Apple has made it a big deal to be the privacy company, even when it's very far from perfect, and even when it's failed in some accounts. It still has had a big effect on how much they sell and why people choose them. And you can see a lot of their marketing is brilliant in this sense. So that's a good example. And there are other smaller examples. So for instance, there's a company called Empathy that is really growing pretty fast, and it's doing online marketing without any kind of personal data. So a lot of small companies are gaining trust and gaining a competitive edge over larger companies by offering this kind of ethical approach that bigger companies are missing out on.
So much for individuals and companies. But what about governments? Governments, of course, collect a huge amount of personal data for surveillance and national security concerns, as well as for data analytics and public policy formation. Governments seem more concerned to collect more and more of our data, something that we have been debating here in the UK in recent months with the Data Processing and Digital Information Bill. Proponents argue that it will provide the government with much-needed powers to keep us safe, while critics argue that it will enable an enhanced Big Brother state. I asked Carissa for her thoughts on this.
Even countries like China are giving up some data collection. So, to the surprise of everyone, I think it was a year ago, China passed one of the most strict privacy laws in the world. And of course, that doesn't mean that the government is not surveilling. It is surveilling. But it has dramatically reduced the kind of personal data that companies can collect. And there have been a lot of speculation about why China would do that. It lost about $1 trillion in the stock market after it did this. But I think one reason is that it realized that any personal data that their companies have, the West is going to hack it, just like they're hacking our personal data. So one very big incentive for governments is that rivals don't get access to our personal data. And how do you do that? You don't collect it. Because if you collect it, it makes you vulnerable. There's no way around it. Now, another possibility, much less optimistic and much more grim, is that we wait until something catastrophic happens and then we regulate the data economy. So the best predictor that something's going to happen in the future is if it happened in the past. And personal data has been used for the purposes of genocide, not once or twice, but many times. And maybe we're going to wait until it happens again in the West to get our act together. And I hope not. But that would also give governments incentives to learn from past mistakes.
In making sense of all of this, it does seem to me to be clear that we are in new territory when it comes to privacy. We are both shaping the information world and being shaped by it. And questions about what should remain private and what should be available publicly are central to this question. Philosophers, humanists, and computer scientists all have a role to play, as do policymakers and politicians. I am not optimistic that we will get the balance right anytime soon. In fact, I think we are only dimly aware of just how much of our personal data is available to those who want it, and also just how active the criminals and fraudsters are in seeking out ways to use our data against us. But I do endorse the idea that we should all of us take a much greater interest in this question, and that we should become more active in securing our own balance. If we are comfortable with a lot of personal data exposure, then great. But if we want less, we should be able to manage that in a sensible way. And that is an important and worthwhile activity.
Once you get intoxicated by the idea of freedom, there's no going back. It's like a child that's born cannot return to the womb.
If it is intoxicating, it is also surely worth acting now. For the final word, once again, it's over to Carissa Veliz.
The decisions we make today are going to determine the way we live for decades to come. How we vote, what kind of power governments have, how companies earn their keep. And now is the time when decisions are being made. So the least we can do is think quite carefully about these issues.
Thank you for listening. In our next episode, we will be exploring the ethics of AI. As a technology that is inserting itself into so many elements of our lives, visible and invisible, this is surely one of the critical questions of our age. In particular, I will be exploring what AI is up to today and whether these are good things that advance humanity or bad things that threaten us as a species. Please join us for the ride.